With a firm handshake and big smiles, a solid pat on the back and words of mutual admiration, the French president wrapped up G7 2019 and handed the baton to next year's host, U.S. President Donald Trump. After 3 days of meetings, dinners, and picture opportunities in glitzy Biarritz, it seemed almost as if the sparkling setting had permeated the summit, uniting Emmanuel Macron and Mr. Trump along with the leaders of Japan, Canada, Italy, Germany and the UK. U.S. President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron hug after their joint press conference at the G7 summit in Biarritz, southwestern France. AAP, there was a tremendous unity. President Trump declared in that final press conference, "We would have stayed for another hour. Nobody wanted to leave. We were accomplishing a lot, but I think more importantly, we were getting along very well, but were they?" Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, right, takes part in a working session with G7 leaders during the G7 summit in Biarritz, France on Sunday, August 25, 2019. AAP, as the leaders' spouses were bussed off to a Basque village sampling local sangria and shopping for espadrilles, and thousands of protesters rallied in nearby towns demanding equality and climate change action. What was actually resolved at the G7 table? Related articles. China, is that you calling? The summit began in a Trump-induced tizzy, after the U.S. president whacked huge tariffs on Chinese imports, escalating a trade war and sending global markets into meltdown. Hours before leaders arrived at the beachside haven, Mr. Trump tweeted the news along with this explanation: "Our country has been losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year to China, with no end in sight. We don't need China," he went on to call Chinese President Xi Jinping an enemy for the United States. The summit began in a Trump-induced tizzy, after the U.S. president whacked huge tariffs on Chinese imports, escalating a trade war and sending global markets into meltdown. AP, cue Angela Merkel death stare. The German Chancellor and the rest of the G7 leaders were deeply unimpressed, each using the forum to urge President Trump to pull back from the feud, which had implications for everyone at the table. Boris Johnson went in all guns blazing, but when it came time for breakfast with the U.S. president, Mr. Johnson ended up congratulating the president on everything that the American economy is achieving, before meekly adding, but just to register as a faint sheep-like notive. Our view on the trade war: we are in favor of trade peace on the whole. Others must have used stronger language because within 24 hours, the U.S. president said Beijing had called, and the two countries were ready to resume talks and patch things up. Mr. Trump also changed his tune on chairmanship. "It's why President Xi is a great leader. He understands, and it's going to be great for China, great for the U.S., it's going to be great for the world," he said. Great news for the global economy. Until Zhang Shuang from the Chinese Foreign Ministry said this regarding the telephone call between the two countries that the U.S. has referred to: "I haven't heard about this situation. Awkward." Currently, China and the U.S. are discussing the next round of face-to-face trade talks scheduled in September. French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte greet United Kingdom's Prime Minister Boris Johnson ahead of the informal dinner of the Group of Seven G7 summit in Biarritz, France on August 24, 2019. AAP, the Iran standoff. Tensions over Iran's nuclear program were always high on President Macron's agenda for the summit, and early on he announced the G7 leaders had agreed on a united course of action. When asked about this hours later, Donald Trump contradicted the French host, saying it hadn't been discussed. Then Iran showed up. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif unexpectedly jetted into Biarritz for talks with the French president and officials. It was a swifty diplomatic maneuver by Mr. Macron, keen to make progress on the issue while the key players were all in one place. By the end of the summit, G7 leaders had come to a consensus: 2 points. No one wants Iran to have nuclear arms, ever. And the situation should never threaten regional stability. Donald Trump indicated he would, if conditions were right, now be prepared to meet his Iranian counterpart, President Hassan Rouhani, to try to end the standoff. This may happen at the UN General Assembly in New York at the end of September. However, in the days following G7, President Rouhani reiterated Iran will not talk to the U.S. until all sanctions imposed on Tehran are lifted. Nothing has rallied more anger at home and criticism from abroad than Jair Bolsonaro's response to fires raging in parts of the Amazon region. PA, Amazon funding goes up in flames. President Trump didn't show up to the key working session on climate issues. His advisors later claimed it clashed with meetings with Germany and India, but vision of the climate session contradicted this, showing German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi sitting at the table, next to Mr. Trump's empty chair. Boris Johnson, meantime, was mucking around and had to be shushed by Emmanuel Macron as he called the table to order. When class finally got underway, leaders agreed on a $32 million funding package to help countries fighting forest fires in the Amazon. A war of words broke out between Mr. Bolsonaro and Mr. Macron over Brazil's management of the fires, and a derogatory Facebook post mocking France's First Lady, Brigitte Macron. Mr. Bolsonaro has since softened his stance, saying he will consider accepting funding, but first he wants an apology from Mr. Macron. As for the U.S., in the days following the summit, a spokesperson for the Trump administration said America never agreed to the financial aid package decided in the climate summit. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sits between British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and German Chancellor Angela Merkel as they take part in a meeting at the G7 summit in Biarritz, France. AAP, Bojo sink or swim D. But Boris Johnson had a lot riding on his first big summit as British Prime Minister. As the clock ticks towards the October 31st deadline for the UK to leave the EU, he was given a huge boost by the US President, who repeatedly told reporters at the summit Mr. Johnson was the right man for the job, talking up a very big US-UK trade deal and referring to the EU as a dead weight. They won't have that anchor around their ankle, because that's what they've had, President Trump said. Mr. Johnson was keen to show EU leaders he was serious about striking a new deal, and said as he left Biarritz that he was marginally more optimistic about doing so. But within days of returning to London, the Prime Minister launched a Brexit bombshell, asking the Queen to suspend Parliament to force through a no-deal Brexit. Scott Morrison with President Trump at the G7 summit in France last week. Supplied, ScoMo scores the spotlight. He announced a joint initiative with the OECD and New Zealand to encourage reporting of extreme or terrorist content online, and met with everyone from the President of Chile to the Indian Prime Minister. But his bilateral meeting with the British leader and a 20-minute sit-down with Donald Trump were undoubtedly his biggest moments on the world stage. In a very jovial get-together with Boris Johnson, the leaders discussed England's stunning Ashes win hours earlier, then moved on to a post-Brexit trade deal, which Mr. Morrison believes can be done in less than a year. He'll have some competition from the US, also keen to be the first cab off the rank after October 31st. We've been setting our own records when it comes to striking agreements around the world, so we're pretty match fit when it comes to these issues, a confident Mr. Morrison told reporters as the summit came to an end. His pull aside with Donald Trump turned into an official meeting, attended by the likes of U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, covering trade and the global economy, North Korea and Hong Kong. Scott Morrison says the world is paying attention to what Australia is doing after talking trade and strategic issues with leaders at the G7 summit in France. AAP, meantime, the Prime Minister's wife, Jenny Morrison, spent her days picking peppers, visiting the beach and shopping with the other leaders' spouses. As the Prime Minister acknowledged, "We're a long way from the Shire," referring to their home in Sydney South. Macron, host extraordinary Emmanuel Macron has been widely praised for his charm and aptitude in navigating the mixed bag of G7 personalities. It's been said that he fastidiously studied each leader beforehand in order to best manage their expectations and egos. Last year's G7 ended in disaster with Mr. Trump refusing to sign the joint communiqué, then launching a blitz of angry tweets at the 2018 host, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. As a result, Mr. Macron announced that he had decided to scrap the traditional joint statement this year and focus instead on closed-door meetings and strategy. Despite that, there was a short joint statement released, outlining consensus but no tangible commitment to action on key issues from Libya to Ukraine and the escalation of violence in Hong Kong. No firm action, but no diplomatic disasters either. The summit ended with a positive outlook for the trade war, and a message of hope regarding the Iranian stoosh. Mr. Macron, 41, may not be popular on the domestic front, but his performance in Biarritz was impressive. U.S. President Donald Trump, his wife Melania Trump and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison posed for the leaders' photo during the G7 summit in Biarritz, France. AAP, G7 2020 Golf, anyone. The U.S. president said the 2020 summit will likely be held at his Trump National Doral Miami Golf Resort, and spent a good few minutes of the final press conference in a mini-sales pitch, describing the luxury bungalows and facilities. There's already a row over the guest list, as America wants Russia readmitted to the group. Moscow was axed from G8 in 2015 after it annexed Crimea. I think it would be better to Russia inside the tent than outside the tent, President Trump told reporters in Biarritz. President Macron said the decision will depend on Russia's behavior regarding the crisis in Ukraine. Either way, next year will be a show to behold. The summit will take place in the middle of the 2020 U.S. presidential election campaign, probably at the key candidate's personal golf resort. Copyright 9 Digital Thai Limited 2019. Let's block ads. Why?